So at this point, I call this meeting to order. I don't know if you could hear that. And let's start the debate. And now I am looking for a speaker in the affirmative. And Joe Barnes, please unmute yourself and give a speech of up to 4 minutes in the affirmative for the resolution.
Hello, my name is Joe Barnes. I'm born and raised in a state that has been blue most of my lifetime, and so it's kind of weird for me to have these positions, but I do get to discuss them very often with people around me. So I would like to say that first of all, I do not believe that the United States was founded as a democracy, and anybody who bandies about the term democracy should be pretty familiar with the statement that democracy is two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for dinner. So when voting is happening, politics is a way for people to impose their will peacefully on other people, right? There's not as much bloodshed as wolves and sheep deciding what's for dinner, but you're getting a say in how things are, how resources, how time, how people are managed at a larger scale. And if you scale down, you can see that the stakes get a lot higher when some people are benefiting from a system and other people are just paying into it. So you scale it down, you look at wolves and sheep, you look at maybe the family. So if you had 5 children and 2 parents voting on how much allowance children should get, of course, the children are going to keep bumping their allowance up because they want to buy more things. And if the parents, even if the parents are voting, the parents are the only ones paying, and the children are deciding who gets allowances, who gets resources, who gets dinner first, whatever it is, but they really don't have any stake other than a benefit. And if you scale this up into things like an HOA, if you own a property, the stakes are a little higher, because there's more money involved, and money means your time, money means resources. So if you don't own a unit in the HOA and you get to vote what the people in the HOA do with their money and their time, you're probably going to give yourself some extra benefits, like the ability to use a swimming pool or the ability to have a picnic on the HOA property, even though you're not paying into it. And this scales up even further for city government, state government, and federal government. In federal government, it's absolutely the worst case because there's a huge pool of resources, time and money at the federal level. And if people who are not involved in putting money into that system decide where the money, resources, and time go from that system, they're typically going to give it to themselves more than anybody else. So it's just a very large problem of, 50 million people voting for, or 300 million, and we never get that much turnout, but let's say 50 million people deciding where the money of 300 million people go. And I don't think that it's right for that to happen. I mean, like I said, if you're at the small scale here and you're a parent with children, you're going to see your money disappear really quickly if your children get to decide what you spend it on. And if you're ever involved in property ownership with HOAs, you can see the exact same thing happen. There's a lot of waste if people who have no stake start telling you what to do. So this is where the core of my belief comes from, is that the resources of a large system should not be managed by people who have no stake. And if it was up to me, I would even say that people who do not have children should potentially not get the right to vote, because the nation is something that persists long after a single lifetime. And if you have no stake in the future of your nation, then maybe you shouldn't have a say in what's going to happen to it, because voting is not something that has an immediate effect only. Your vote doesn't affect the next 4 years. Your vote affects the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years in the future. I would even say that, people who, like the original founding fathers, people who don't own property have much less of a stake in where things are going. And if you look at studies of people who do vote, that proportionately, the number of people who vote as a percentage goes very far up while people get more income. So there's I believe it's 70% plus of people who make over 150K a year vote. And as it goes down, they vote less because the stakes are higher.
So Joe, could you please wrap it up?
Yep, I am done.
Excellent, excellent. So let's show some appreciation for our brave first speaker. Take some courage to do that. Okay, so we're going to entertain one or two questions. Since I can see everybody on screen, I will call on people myself. Andrew Hume, please unmute yourself and ask your question of curiosity through me to the speaker.
Mr. Chair, would the speaker speak to whether or not people without children, without any overt special property interest in the nation, can actually make reasoned discussions and decisions about what the country ought to do?
I do believe that it is possible for somebody who has no investment in the future to think and to critically reason. What I don't think is that they really have any skin in the game when it comes to where things are going in the future. Because once they are gone, whatever decision they made, everybody else in the nation, in the state, in the HOA, in the family has to deal with their decision.
Thank you. Thank you. Asked and answered. John Bork, please unmute yourself and ask your question of curiosity through me, the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The speaker mentioned something about not having a stake in the game, and so therefore not, and some statistics relating to therefore how they tend to decide how to use resources. Is it possible, would the speaker comment on other ways of measuring stake in the game, for instance, home ownership, an influencer in the community, people who maybe don't have the resources at the moment to actually pay monetarily, but they're doing other things for the community, for the health of the community? Thank you.
Yes, I do believe, again, like I said, it is definitely possible for someone to contribute, to put skin in the game. But typically, the stakes that you have in a large system are going to be limited by the real resources in the system. And being a thinker, being a volunteer, being a community leader does not necessarily mean that you're going to stay there, that you're going to be there later, that you're going to have any reason to make the best decision for the future of the organization after you're gone. Now, that doesn't mean you can't make those decisions, but there's no real consequence if you fail, because you won't have a child or grandchild in that community. You won't have, you may not be in that community. You won't have a house in that community that's subject to the decisions that you've tried to make in the interest of that community. So once you're gone, again, even if you do believe in the cause, your decisions are gone without you, and you don't have any real stake in there. Even if you are trying to critically reason for the best of the community. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Thank you. Asked and answered. So one of the things that I did not say at the beginning of this is that we envision this as a red-only debate. But we actually had not decided whether or not we were going to let blues ask questions. So when you line up to ask a question, your whip will probably ask you if you are a red or a blue. But that said, given that we have a smaller room than is often the case, I think I will take one additional question. Colleen, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker through me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. How would the speaker suggest how it's determined whether someone is paying taxes and therefore qualifies to vote? What evidence proves this requirement? And thank you for taking my question.
Well, thank you for your question. I think it's pertinent. I am a little bit extreme in this situation in that everybody does pay, everyone who pays taxes files federal forms, at least at the federal level, and state forms at the state level to show that your taxes are paid. And even at the city level, if you run a business, city and county, you'll have to submit paperwork to prove that you are paying taxes, whether they're, $3 or $100,000 or millions of dollars. In the case of my view, I believe that even collecting payouts from a large system means that you should not be allowed to decide where that money goes. So if you are a net negative on the system, you should not be able to put input in there. So again, this comes back to like a child who's doing chores and collecting allowance. This is the smallest possible example that I can think of that scales up. So if the child is doing chores and you're giving them an allowance, I mean, they're benefiting your system, right? Your family. And so they should get something for it and you give them an allowance. But if you let all the children choose how much they get paid for allowance for doing laundry, which is something you could have done anyway, then they're going to decide to bump their allowance up and up and up, But in terms of proving, you have tax forms. If you just decide not to deal with net negatives and net positives in the system, you at the very least do have a taxpayer form that has a name on it.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, we will close with our first speaker. And once again, jazz hands are called for. And I am now looking for our first speech in the negative. Andrew Hume, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, I'll do my speech, which is what I think you meant. So I told you with actually being on the positive on this. After all, no taxation without representation is, of course, one of the mantras from American history. And in fact, a recent YouGov poll recorded 50% of Republicans say that paying no taxes means no vote. By comparison, 43% of independents lean that way and 31% of Democrats lean that way. So this is a reasonably popular position. In Sydney, Australia, which is where I originally came from, anyone who pays property taxes within the city can vote in the local township races. That includes companies and people who don't live in Sydney. They're all allowed to vote, at least at the municipal sort of level. I like the idea of people with skin in the game being encouraged to vote. And I think that was part of what the first speaker spoke about. But one is led to understand, is money the only reference here? Does that mean, governments do more than manage money. They manage where we fight wars. Does that mean that only families, which include enlisted members of the military, can vote for the government? There are many resources involved here, and it seems somewhat petty to trace lineage back from the resources being managed back to who, quote unquote, is responsible for them. But so you start thinking about what other groups are involved here. What about felons? What about teens? Teens typically can't vote anywhere, but they pay, a bunch of them pay taxes. Felons pay taxes, particularly after they've been released. And in many states, they aren't allowed to vote. So the question is, what do you do about these groups? Historically, there have been even more egregious examples, such as blacks, and until the early 1900s, women. They had jobs, they paid taxes, but they weren't allowed to vote. I think where I think I'm going with this is when you get these weird sorts of questions, which seem oddly provocative, the real question is, this sounds like a proxy for something else. Why should we be restricting voting rights at all? Republicans generally seem responsible for most voting restrictions, and many of these seem clumsy attempts to discourage blocks of voters who would likely vote not Republican. I like to think of these attempts in a positive way. I would like to see them as attempts to get better, more informed voters. And certainly the first speaker would say that anyone who pays taxes is somehow more informed. There's a book by Jason Brennan called Against Democracy, which covers this issue way better than I can. But the basic point of the book is that people who can talk meaningfully about government should get more of a vote than those who can't. And there are lots of ways of doing this. As I said before, there's obviously skin in the game, people who pay taxes or families with enlisted people. You might say that some people who understand civics should be allowed should have more of a vote than people who don't. And you can even imagine, well, I won't go into other schemes. I think it's about time for me to finish up. So I'll just leave it at that. End of discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Cheers for our first speaker in the negative. So I am now looking for questions of curiosity to be asked through me. And amazing. Okay, I see a hand. Joe, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to know if there is a meaning, at least in the speaker's opinion, is there a meaningful differentiation between something like, for example, IQ and or other traditionally frowned upon ways of limiting inputs into a system like voting, and what you would call a quote unquote meaningful talk about government?
So I think the most useful way I would think about this, and this is discussed by Brennan in his book, you could, for example, take the citizenship part of the becoming a citizen test, right? There are citizenship questions related to there. I think the bottom line is, if you want to divide the electorate up into roughly quarters, the bottom 3/4 are really poorly informed. In fact, arguably the bottom quarter actually doesn't know anything significant. In fact, of those, the surveys say that 12% can't, only 12% can tell you which is more conservative, the Democrats or the Republicans. There is such a wealth of disknowledge and misinformation down there that they're a stain on our democracy. But anyway, no, I think a citizenship test or something like that could be a useful test for who knows what about the government.
Thank you. Thank you. Asked and answered. Are there any additional questions for the speaker? Luke, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Mr. Chair, can the speaker go in deeper detail on his comparison of a property requirement for voting to a military draft style?
Luke, you just muted yourself accidentally.
Sincere apologies. That's probably something I should do on purpose more often. Mr. Chair, can the speaker please go into deeper detail on his comparison of property requirement for voting to service, military service or diplomatic service or whatever requirement for partaking in foreign policy?
Sure. It's in the vein of the government manages plenty of resources, money of which is obviously the most preeminent in our discussions. But a lot of political decisions seem to factor very widely on how many military people will die in this attempt. And it seems to me, if you're going to manage deaths as a resource, which they appear to be doing, then it seems to me people who belong to those families have some say in this, particularly these days when so few people serve in the military. It seems their families ought to have some say, at least across foreign policy, where we start deciding where to fight wars.
Thank you. Thank you. If there is one additional question, I will take it. Otherwise, we will move on to our next speaker. Yeah, Henry, please unmute yourself and ask your question of curiosity to the speaker through the chair.
Thank you. The speaker mentioned that this debate, the issue of who should vote, whether only taxpayers should vote seems to be a proxy for some other discussion, and I wondered if you would elaborate on that a bit. What discussion is that a proxy for?
Well, I hope the press largely portrays this as an attempt by conservatives to limit the vote to people who will reliably vote in a conservative fashion. I want to think more positively about this, and I think what they're really after is a more informed electorate. And you know, I touched on this briefly in the talk. There are ways of measuring how ill-informed and misinformed people are, particularly in the lower parts of the electorate. But and I think we just want to try and move away. We need to have people who understand that there is a president, who can name the president, for an example. You know, it seems weird to be having people like that decide close elections. It's not to say you shouldn't, but it seems weird to do so. It's basically to get a more informed electorate, is what I think. Of course, in the old days, it was just to get men to vote, which is why we had landowning men being the only voters.
Thank you. Thank you. And once again, some kudos for our first speaker in the negative, and also for some great questions. So I am now looking for a second speech in the affirmative. Dan Trimble, are you available? And please unmute yourself and give your speech of up to 4 minutes. I think Dan is having some technical difficulties. Going to give him a moment here. Okay, going to give this about another 10 seconds or so. Yeah, Dan, are you able, you're connecting to audio. Okay. You're still connecting. We can't hear you yet.
Wait. I think we got it. 1 second. I just merged him with audio. Dan, unmute yourself.
We did that? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Great. Okay, Dan, please give your speech of up to 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks all for your time. And I want to compliment that prior speaker. I would vote for him in a position of leadership. I like that kind of thought. And he reminds us that there are a multitude of ways to try and figure this out. But think about this. There are 240 eligible voters in America. 240 million. 80 million of them didn't vote. So is that a sign that voting is really not as precious as we make it out to be, because some people ignore it? Is that lazy? Now, I understand a no voting can be a statement, but I tend to think that that's not what 80 million people did. But that's just something I have to think about. Now, I'm no guru on taxes or voting, and I'm not a data guru as well. But I would love it if my country decided kind of once and for all what is a fair taxation system, and then went with it for 20 years, and I would hold my leaders to spending within that amount of money that is collected, with the penalty of death. And I say that only partly flippantly, but I think they've destroyed our currency and our economy by allowing them to spend beyond our means. But I think the Americans are fair-minded people. If we find a fair way of taxation, they will accept it, and we could go along without this batting it back and forth. Now that brings me to, there's all kinds of ways to tax people: flat taxes, value add tax, consumption tax, taxing people, businesses, corporations. We're dancing around them all. But I was really tickled to hear this vote based on taxation, because I've thought about that before, and I don't want to repeat the reasons that have been put out there before, but I believe that fair-minded people believe everyone should put into this pot. We're all stakeholders. We all take advantage of the things in our country. Everyone should have a stake in it. And that means all people that are paying zero or less. Some people get more benefits than zero. I find that troubling that they can vote for other people to pay for their services and their gain of whatever the government has to offer. And that also includes, and my wife reminded me this, rich people that get out of paying taxes. Okay, go ahead. You don't get to vote either. I mean, you might make all kinds of money, pay taxes or not, but if you can skirt taxes, you lose votes. And that's part of the incentive for people to pay taxes, so they will have a stake and can vote. I think it incentivizes tax paying. But the biggest problem with it is that I don't know how close we are to 50%. But when 50% of our country is not paying taxes and can vote to the other 50% to pay for all the services, you're really saying that we're ending this democratic process, because that leads us to where we are now, where our currency is destroyed and they can just vote themselves goodies and not have to have any stake in the pain of making those resources develop. So that's probably the biggest worry, that it truly is a tipping point where it can wreck our country. I think, like the previous speaker said, I think there are some wonderful ways. I just wish we could settle on one and move forward and just stop kicking this issue around. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And wow, that was 3 minutes and 59 seconds. So I don't know if you were timing yourself or not, but if you were, you did a fabulous job.
Thank you.
And so now I'll be taking questions. Derek Hughes, please unmute yourself and ask your question of this speaker through the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question would be for the speaker. Is any form of tax payment acceptable for being able to vote? And if the answer is no, what form of tax payment would you consider the correct one, and why?
Well, that's an excellent question. I don't consider $1 of taxes earning you the vote, although if you want to be legalistic about it, that is a fact. They pay taxes, and that we can decide it. I don't really care what we decide, as long as we decide it together and move forward. But I think it should be substantial, and I think they should feel the pain of their vote. How you make that judgment, I can't say off the top of my head.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think I'll take another question. And by the way, I try to mix things up and bring people in who we haven't already heard from. So I don't necessarily go in order calling on questioners. Bruce Noth, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. In full disclosure, I am blue, and honestly, I had thought I would just listen and not ask any questions. But I am curious for the speaker, and actually an earlier speaker as well, if the logic that only taxpayers should vote applies at all levels of government. And the reason I'm asking that is because at municipal, state, all levels except the federal government, it is imperative that those entities basically have a balanced budget. However, the federal government, that is not true, and it's not true because, so to speak, the federal government prints money. And I understand that, a lot of us operate under the sort of the understanding that it's our taxes that pay our way at the federal level, when actually that's not fully true. And if the federal government did not run a deficit, and we saw this at the end of the
okay, so Bruce, I've got to ask you to hone in on a question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was going on too long there. Basically, I'll stop there. Given that the federal government essentially prints money, terrible word, but does the same logic apply to the federal feds as it would at the state and local levels?
Well, I think it's the rights of every level to decide for themselves. Right now, I'm speaking more about the federal level, because I do agree the states have most of them have balanced budgets. I wish we did, but I think I have to include that we are going to hold our leaders to the fire that they cannot spend and print at will. We've allowed this, and we're as guilty as they are for letting it happen. But it's America. Every taxation body has their right to decide. And I got to be honest with you, after hearing some other things, I'm not sure that the taxation to vote is the best idea, but it's definitely worthy of consideration.
Okay, thank you, thank you. I will take one more question. Nancy Ross, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was intrigued by the first questioner and his question about what taxes count. And so I'd like to hear the speaker think a little bit about taxes like sales tax, gas tax. It is probably true that as adults, we all pay some form of tax, whether we actually pay income tax or not. So has he thought about those other forms of taxes?
I'm trying to think about, I think I only pay one tax to the federal government. So sales tax would be a state thing. This would replace other taxes. You bring it up points that remind me that there is a lot to consider here. And but at the end of the day, if you're net positive in paying taxes to the country, that puts you in a category that is of stakeholder.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So I will now move on to our second speaker in the negative. And this time I'm not going to get confused and refer to her as a questioner, but realize that she is a speaker. Kimberly Eakin, are you in the room, and can you unmute yourself and give your speech of up to 4 minutes?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I am a red, just want to clarify that. And I wanted to just talk about two things. One, it's very unclear what a taxpayer is. And I think Nancy and Dan just went around that bush a little bit. So it's an ambiguous and not clear term when it's just written taxpayers. Because when I went to fill up my gas tank today, I paid a lot of taxes to a lot of different entities. So by definition, I was a taxpayer. That goes for a lot of different groups. And so I kind of want to talk about people that are not putting money into the system, but might need to be considered as a valid American voter. I am a stay-at-home parent. I don't make any income from outside entities. There are about 5.5 million of us. And we are at home taking care of our children, our spouses, our community. And I think a lot of people in this room would agree that stay-at-home parents are a valuable part of the culture of our society. And it seems in the data that they grow some pretty good kids that are less stressed, less aggressive, and do better in scholarship. So I'll leave it at that. Another group that I thought was worthy of talking about are the college teens. So the kids between 18 and 24 in college. There's about there's 30 million of them. And 60% of them do not work. They just go to school. So in my case, my 18-year-old's doing a little job at a bookstore, so she would qualify as an income taxpayer. But her roommate and her 4 suite mates would not. Although they are going to school, and I'm pretty sure their parents consider that their job to make good grades. I would think that they are thinkers, and I would also think that they were civically minded young people. Another group that I think we should consider are military retirees. I am a retired U.S. Army sergeant. And when I turned 59 and a half, I will have a nice little check from the government. That's not tax. So there's 2.2 million military retirees. And I would argue that duty, honor, and country qualify us as very patriotic, capable voters. And lastly, a smaller group that I didn't look up the numbers, but are small business owners. A lot of times, small business owners don't make money for the first 2 or 3 years. They have a net negative. They don't reach a net profit for a few years. So are they not an income? Are they not eligible for voting until they make a profit? So those are a few of the groups that I think that we should consider when we think about taxpayers should be the only voters in the country. And that concludes my remarks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to our brave second speaker in the negative. And so I will now be and by the way, well under time, nicely done. And so now I will be looking for the questions of curiosity. Michael Snare, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker through the chair.
What the speaker was just saying made a lot of sense to me, and I'm wondering if she or someone else can address also the concept of seniors, as I understand it. Many people live on Social Security benefits that are not taxed as well.
Kimberly, you can just leave yourself unmuted. You can just leave yourself unmuted.
Sure.
Until
I don't know the tax status of seniors. I didn't look into that. I do know many people that are on Social Security are also working. So I couldn't really speak to that. But I'd also say there are taxpayers with many dependents that don't pay taxes. There are taxpayers with many deductions that don't pay taxes. And there are taxpayers that make below the poverty line and they also don't pay taxes.
Thank you. Thank you. Joe, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would like to know if the speaker has considered the difference in her opinion between a what's called a use tax, which pays for maintenance, and a tax that's paid for governance. So, for example, like paying for gas and paying for roads is going to go to the maintenance of those systems, whereas like income tax is going to go to politicians to create pork barrel programs. And that's something that is decided by the population where it is going to go.
I actually don't know exactly the route of all of our tax dollars and where they go exactly. But I would say that ultimately our legislature and our government and our politicians directly or indirectly influence much of our taxes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Great speaker, great questions. And so that concludes the people who we had arranged beforehand as speakers. And so now things are much more open. And, you know, if you've had some thoughts that you would like to share with us, please get in line to be a speaker. If you don't feel like you've got 4 minutes, it doesn't have to be 4 minutes. You know, it can just be whatever time you think you need to make your point. And again, don't do that by raising your hand. Do that through your whip. So for now, I'm looking for another speech in the affirmative. And Mark Ang, please unmute yourself and give your speech of up to 4 minutes.
Hey, Paul. Yeah, sorry, I was having a difficult.
No, Mr. Chair.
I was actually
Mr. Chair. There is no Paul for the next hour.
Okay, whatever, Mr. Chair. All right. So I was actually on the blue chat, and I got to hear a little bit of what they were saying. And they actually had 120 people in their chat, which I thought was fascinating. We really have to up our attendance on the red side but there's a major problem. Reds don't want to debate these issues. They want to just believe that it's going to get fixed somehow without participating in the civic process. So I thought it was important to kind of weigh in. I heard, some of our previous speakers, and I want to address some of the points. First of all, there is no stopping us from creating a mechanism to provide exemptions to the stay-at-home moms, to the veterans, to the people that may not traditionally pay taxes. And I myself am a small business owner, so I totally know what it was like to not make money for a few years there and be eating it. And of course, I was thinking, how would that feel if I wasn't able to vote during that time? So these are the types of things that absolutely we need to provide exemptions on what is, but we shouldn't throw away the attempt to put, I hate to say this word because it has such a negative connotation, but we need barriers to voting. I'm sorry, I don't believe that just anyone and everyone is entitled to that. That is the problem with this country. People are entitled, so they feel entitled that a basic requirement of living the government must provide to us is an iPhone, that we are all entitled to that, or to free internet. It's starting to get really ridiculous because those of us who work hard understand that if you work hard, you end up valuing things more. And we need to create a society where the young and the healthy can achieve and try their best to be the best they can be and realize their potential without just saying, hey, I can just sit around and collect a welfare paycheck or abuse the unemployment system, for example, and consider themselves a taxpayer with something valuable to input in the voting booth. I'm sorry, that may be a controversial stance, but I really do believe in barriers. Now, the barriers can provide exemptions. We can exempt people from that barrier if, for example, they've served military time. I'm all about that because you have demonstrated in a few years of your life a heightened buy-in into the system where you should have a voice. Same with small business owners, same with stay-at-home moms. So these barriers can be like, hey, you can be exempt if your income. And I actually agree with one of the questions asked in the negative earlier is, profit really should not be the barometer of sorts for voting. It should be on back to common sense. Did you put into the system? Did you care for the greater good to be able to vote for things that impact the bigger system and the bigger community and the greater good? That to me is the basic question. That bar is not answered today. That question is answered in the negative today because you have people that are collecting welfare checks, highly entitled, even criminals that are just able to vote because we are not putting enough barriers around it. So I think that we need to have barriers. We should have exemptions, and there should be a well-crafted legislation around that to cut off, especially in California, where we have so many people voting that do not care about the system and are just voting for their entitlements and that gravy train to continue. Sorry, but our producers here are getting squeezed to death while the takers are, voting more and more raises to their paychecks that are provided by us, the taxpayers. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. So now looking for questions of curiosity for the speaker to be asked through the chair. And I see Kathy King. I don't believe you asked a question before. Kathy, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, currently the states decide whether or not felons can vote, if and when they can vote. Do you suppose that this would be a federal issue or a state issue as to whether or not people who don't pay taxes or whatever restrictions you put on, would that be a state issue or would that be a federal issue? Mr. Speaker, I would ask that of the speaker. Mr. Chairman, I ask that of the speaker.
Yeah, so I don't think felons or people that have broken the law and that are locked up in jail, that are spending time in prison, having the taxpayers already foot the bill on that, should be voting, period. So maybe we make that a federal issue and say that's just not appropriate. So I revert back to common sense and bottom line for we the people here.
Okay. Thank you. Ann Russell, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Ann, you're muted. Ann, you're still muted.
In the room. I was looking to find the unmute button. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask the speaker what potential barriers you think would be effective given the entire population. We have some very wealthy people who may or may not pay taxes. We have middle class and we have lower class and we have poverty-stricken people. What barriers would you put up that would encompass all of those groups? And that's my question.
That's a very good question. Thank you for asking that. And that's a very good clarifying question. I believe that there's once again, reverting to common sense, those who take more from the system should not be able to vote. So if you're collecting a welfare check, if you're a felon in prison, okay, and you're not showing a contribution to society, like if you're raising a kid, if you provided military service, if you're taking a risk on a business, and that may be a higher barrier to prove also, because I know that may be abused sometimes, but all these things where you're contributing to the betterment of society, you should be able to vote. Now, if you are just blatantly taking, that needs to be stopped right away. And I think that's that's a way to do it without severely complicating, because I really also don't like the whole, profit being the barometer for whether you're able to vote. Because there are certain years that very productive citizens are not making income, are not showing on paper that they are profiting or that are there, so I don't even think taxes, paying income tax is the barometer for this. It should just be, if you're not taking from the system, you should be able to vote. And then those who are taking from the system should be barred from voting.
Thank you. I think I'll take one more question. Ann Russell, please unmute yourself and ask your question through the chair to the speaker. Ann, you're muted.
Mr. Chair, I just asked my question 1 minute ago.
Oh boy. Well,
came back to me. I just didn't take my hand down. I
my apologies. So
no, my apologies. I'm sorry.
My apologies. This is what happens when you have a 75-year-old chair. All right.
Still young. That's very young.
Michael Snare, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Well, Mr. Chairman, what I'd like to ask the speaker is how he feels about tax avoidance. We're talking about disenfranchising a poor person who is perhaps at best able to work a minimum wage job and possibly in the future pay a minimal amount of tax, when we have a tax structure that allows the wealthy to avoid paying huge amounts of tax that they owe. Shouldn't they also be penalized?
I don't think that that's a relevant question to what we're talking about here. We're not talking about penalties on tax avoidance. We're talking about barriers to voting based on income tax, which I actually, maybe I should have been a negative speech. I don't believe that income tax is the barometer, as I've said many times. So I think that question that was just asked is a total non sequitur.
Thank you.
And it sounds very liberal too. So that sounds like a good question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the speaker and for the questions. We will now go to our next speaker in the negative. Kathy King, please unmute yourself and give your speech of up to 4 minutes.
Mr. Chair, the first speaker in the negative hit most of the points that I was going to make. I would also like to include grandparents, for example, who are receiving Social Security but are taking care of their grandchildren. I'd also like to include those who have been they're disabled and unable to work, along with some parents who this is the world today. A lot of people co-parent and they aren't married, and one of the parents is supporting the person who's staying home and taking care of the kids by the agreement of both parties. So we need to include people like that too. But I also think that if we say only people who pay taxes can vote, we would be artificially changing the number of Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, possibly, because our college students likely don't make enough to pay taxes, or else their parents say that they are they jump under their parents' tax returns and they don't get to pay, they don't pay their own taxes because they've been taken as a deduction. And this would rig the election of a lot of young people to those who are actually less educated, less informed. Further, we might be encouraging teenagers to have children just in order to vote if those without children, as was suggested by the first affirmative speaker, are unable to vote, which I think would also be a very big disservice to our country. I think we have enough children of unmarried people already. So those are some thoughts that I have, but I really appreciated the first negative speaker because she hit a lot of the people that I really felt deserve to vote. One more thing is my grandma lived to be 102, and she got wiser as she got older. And I think my parents, who didn't live quite as long, they also aged well and became more wise as they grew older. I'm 76, so I beat you, Mr. Chair. I'm an older lady than you are an old man. And I think you and we share some wisdom, and maybe we don't pay taxes. We should still be allowed to vote. And my grandma, of course, they didn't have, she never worked and she never made any money. So she was out of luck under the proposal that exists as what we're debating today. So I'm totally a negative voter, period.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So now we'll entertain questions. Joe, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker through the chair.
Hello, Mr. Chair. I'd like to know if the speaker in her statement that about changing the composition of the voter rolls has considered the fact that the founders of the nation did in fact design the system to limit voting to people who were wise enough to hold on to property, not just pay taxes. There's actually a more limited right to vote when the system was designed, and I think designed better than it is today.
I don't understand your question.
Sorry, I'll clarify. So I was wondering if when you say that the
when the
composition
speaker,
of the sorry, yes, when the speaker says that the composition of the voting population would change, is she aware that the founding fathers in fact designed the system to have an even more limited voting population than is present today? So so that it has been, in other words, that it has been changed to be more open than it should have been with the design of the nation.
Well, I believe society has changed significantly. Now, a very high percentage of our best and brightest go to college. Back then, you could be in the 8th grade and have an 8th grade education and still be among the brightest and the best. So I think the circumstances have changed tremendously. I don't think
Thank
it's
you.
relevant.
Thank you. Thank you. Asked and answered. So about halfway through the debate, we typically take a break, and most chairs just make it a stretch break. But you know what? I actually make it a real 2-minute break where you can walk away from your computer, but let's try to make it quick, 2 minutes. If you need to visit some room nearby or just want to get up and stretch. In fact, I recommend you get up and stretch even if you don't think you want to. It's generally a good idea.
Mr. Chair, may I have permission to banter with the staff on the break?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Cynthia O'Brien, yes, you are indeed correct. That is indeed a John Wood Jr. in the background with me. He has crashed this debate and is learning all about citizenship and taxation from all of us dear red members around here. So yeah, John's right here.
Hello, Cynthia. Hey, everybody. Hanging out in Philadelphia with Mr. Phillips.
I don't believe he has specifically agreed yet to give an impromptu speech on either side of this debate, but I suppose if Mr. Chair were to specifically ask John for a speech, I'm sure he would be happy.
I'm answering emails in the back of the room, but if anybody wants to pull me in to to fire off some quick remarks, folks just need to let me know what I'm talking about. About 30 seconds to prepare.
We'll brief him. He'll do great. So yeah.
Okay, Luke, let's remember, I've got the gavel. Let's not forget that. Never forget that.
I defer back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so moving on, we have another speech in the affirmative, and you can take up to 4 minutes. Aaron, please unmute yourself and give your speech in the affirmative.
I'm going to assume that you're talking to me, Mr. Chair. Good not try on the last name.
I gave up, Archambault.
There you go. Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I am in the affirmative, and that I agree that much like the first speaker mentioned, that people need to have skin in the game in order to vote. However, I don't believe our voting system that we have in place has any mechanism to enforce any sort of limitations at this point. We have states that can't even implement voter ID, where you have to actually prove that you're a person in order to be able to vote. Thus, I kind of have a challenge of, we want to put this restriction on that you have to pay taxes in order to vote. How am I going to know when somebody paid taxes? Am I going to rely on our lovely federal government IRS rolls? We're going to let that information somehow get out? Oh, wait, it does anyway. So I don't know that our system that's in place now, or ever will be at this point, has the ability to put any sort of restriction on that is going to be meaningful. I do believe that voting should be restricted to people that have skin in the game, as it's been said, and paying taxes is a valid, maybe some sort of valid measure. There has been talk of gas taxes and sales taxes and other taxes, and maybe those are valid taxes, and pretty much anybody who lives in a state thus can vote in the state because they've paid sales tax if they've bought anything, for the most part, unless of course you live in a state that doesn't have sales tax like New Hampshire, and then you're bum out of luck there. But does paying a toll, then going down the interstate, count as a tax? I like I said, think that people need to have skin in the game. I just don't feel that there's any mechanism, any way, any possibility in our current system that you could effectively monitor or manage that, being as that we can't even monitor or manage the most basic of things, like you are a valid citizen of this country and have proof of that in order to be able to vote. So I that's all I have to say. So I'm going to cede the rest of my time back, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And so now I will entertain questions. Frankie Hires, please unmute yourself and ask your question through the chair of the speaker.
Yes, Chair. The question would be, and the speaker actually addresses the difficulty in this, in that without an understanding, a comprehension for the two fundamental principles of taxation that are prescribed constitutionally, that relates to direct taxes, which shall be apportioned. Of course, that 16th Amendment really, well, I'd like to think it inspired that 18th, but trying to reconcile the apportioned taxation, which is property, income, or death, along with the indirect taxation, which is sales tax, or which would be road tax and all that, becomes incredibly difficult to legislate, I think.
And so what is your question?
Yeah, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, so I agree completely. I don't know that there is a way to reconcile that. I don't believe that there's a mechanism that we can put in place that says, okay, you've paid taxes, so therefore you can vote. So I can't answer your question because I don't believe there is a way.
Thank you.
Okay. Kay Halpern, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker.
Yes. Does the speaker believe that, well, I'll just ask the question. Doesn't the question of the speaker, doesn't anyone affected by federal, state, or local government policies and programs, regardless of whether or not they pay taxes, don't they have skin in the game? Are you arguing, excuse me, is the speaker arguing that people who are affected by government policies and programs, again, whether at the federal, the state, or local level, should not have any, if they don't happen to pay taxes, should not have any say in how the government affects them? If this is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people?
So I'm gonna say yes, because skin in the game is not a result. They're not under the thumb of the government. It's one thing, but actually having to shell out the funds and being money, funds, resources extracted from you to give to somebody else, or to pay for somebody else who is not paying in the system, is different than, oh, I have to obey the speed limit, or I have to pay, I have to stop at the stop sign. It's two completely different things. Skin in the game is not a result of taking money from the government. It's a result of giving resources to the government.
I would define skin in the game.
Okay, so please, so question asked and answered. Thank you. Thank you. It's not a debate down to that level. Derek, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker through the chair.
Should the 23.7 million local, state, and federal employees that appropriate and reallocate limited resources be exempt from voting with a conflict of interest?
Oh boy, that's a good question. So I hadn't really thought much about that, Derek, until you just mentioned it, and I think that maybe they should be, because they are biased towards their particular programs, or and would tend to vote for those programs more and more resources. And I would hold that true for, potentially even military and other federal agencies, because they are in the same boat. And I'm just throwing that out as a initial thought. I probably going to get lambasted for that, but so be it.
Well, being lambasted is just part of the deal, isn't it? Mark Eng, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker through the chair.
Yeah, I wanted your thoughts. I want, God, the formality. Address the chairman to ask the speaker his thoughts on would those barriers that I proposed, including, say, putting the burden of showing that you're a contributing skin in the game, whether it's your own property by attaching a property tax bill, or showing your income tax return or proof of veteran status, all of that, would that be sufficient enough to then address your concerns that this is not feasibly possible in execution in the real world? Because I think if we put the burden of proof on the voter, which they should be doing, because voting should not just be like,
Mark,
I show up
please,
without ID to vote, which is the standard now today.
Mark, please hone in on your question.
Yeah. That's my question.
Does the speaker understand
yes,
the question?
So the question is, would the barrier,
Mark,
of burden of proof on the voter? Yes.
Mark, to answer your question, I started out by prefacing that maybe there's not a way. Obviously open to those ideas. However, under the most basic premise that we have thus far of even requesting voter IDs, that somebody actually have to prove that they are a person, we're not even allowed to do that. We're basically saying right now you can just say your name and you can go in and vote. So in order to get to a point where we can say, hey, yes, we want your income tax, or you have to prove you own land, or you have a veteran status, or you somehow have an affidavit of sorts to say that you are something else. Well, I don't even know that you are you, other than you showed me your name or told me your name and I checked you off on a list. So I don't know that that is possible, though I would like to believe that it is.
Okay, and it looks like we have an additional question. Andrew Hume, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Mr. Chair, I would like the speaker to address, perhaps in a little more detail, I believe the number was roughly 23 million people in local, state, and actually federal government who wouldn't be allowed to vote on things because they might somehow be induced to vote for projects that they like or recommend. It would seem like this is actually cutting out the people that actually know the most about what is being planned and can best judge what the trade-offs are. And it seems weird to eliminate all of those folks.
Like I said, that was kind of my off the cuff because that wasn't my original thought, but I do believe that if we were to look at judges and them judging particular incidents or particular events, they would recuse themselves from those that they had a personal interest in. So likewise, should we not have people recusing themselves from voting for particular programs that they have a particular interest in? I could be swayed otherwise potentially, but I do know that federal government and state government and local governments even have a tendency to favor more government as opposed to less government. And as a libertarian, I oppose more government in any way, shape, or form. So if somebody is automatically, without even thinking about the ramifications, going to go in and automatically vote for more government, then maybe they should recuse themselves from that particular arena.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I'll take one more question for the speaker. Ann Russell, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Has the speaker considered in any way that his proposals are very complicated and in fact may require additional federal government departments and people to work in those departments in order to ensure that no one is voting in any of the categories that he's proposed. I think sometimes when we put something in place, well, in current times, when we put something in place, we tend to say it needs another department. And so there would be Department of Ensuring Voters are legitimate or something of that course. Have you given it, has the speaker given any thought to that? Thank you.
So I have, and actually when I started my thought, I was to the point where we don't need, this doesn't work because of the fact that it's the voting system. We can't even, like I said, do basic things at this point. So how are we going to go on and put all these other requirements in when we can't even do the most basic? So I agree that if we had to have all these requirements, it would require some additional agencies or somebody to monitor and manage it. And the federal government and even most state governments and local governments are not equipped to do any of that, because they're not equipped to do 90% of the stuff that they're doing currently. So we can't add this to their plate.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to the speaker and to the questioners. And as the chair, I'd just like to observe the degree to which we are getting into nuance. And, people seem to be thinking about this in, a deeper way than perhaps they had previously. So huge kudos to all of us for that. So we will now move on to our next speaker in the negative, Nancy Ross. Please unmute yourself and give your speech of up to 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to just give a little brief background of myself. I'm a red libertarian and a retired federal government employee. And so I would say that not all federal government employees believe in bigger government. And I wanted to address this stake or skin in the game issue. And our elected officials make many, many more decisions as our representatives than just the budget at all levels. And many of these decisions have a great effect on a lot of people, regardless of whether they're taxpayers or not. And my background in natural resources, there's things like the Endangered Species Act, setting aside new national parks, the Civil Rights Act, and then war, whether we go to war or not. And so many of these decisions are much more longer term and have far greater stakes than just the annual budget. And the idea of setting more barriers as to who votes seems to me that there's an assumption that taxpayers would be more likely to be fiscally conservative than the general population of the United States. And I believe that's a false assumption. I think taxpayers are just as diverse in their opinions as anyone else. And so I don't understand this whole idea of setting more barriers. Seems like some of the speakers just want to make sure that they set barriers so that people are voting for things that they agree with, and that's not our system. I believe a lot of non-taxpayers have a lot of skin in the game. 18-year-olds can go off to war and they may or may not be taxpayers. They care about the future of our country. As a libertarian, I believe that we have a lot of people in our prison systems who cannot vote, who are there just simply from using marijuana or cocaine or some other drugs that I don't believe should be illegal in the United States. And I would also point out that our elected representatives are the ones that make laws and policy and pass budgets, not government employees. So the idea of not letting government employees vote because they'll vote for their programs, they don't have anything to do with the budgets. They simply implement the budgets that are given to them. So I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. A different perspective. And so looking for questions. And I see Aaron. Aaron, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, the speaker mentions that the people working in the government are not the ones that are setting the budgets and not the ones that are making the laws. I would ask that that the speaker address how the regulations that do in fact impose a lot of times financial burdens on the citizens, and also the fact that these organizations, the government uses zero-based budgeting, and every year each department will request funds, which then the Congress will take and vote on, how the departments are not involved in the budgeting process.
Okay, could you hone in on the question, or did the speaker understand the question?
I understood the question, and it's certainly true that agencies do submit their budgets to the president, who submits them to Congress, but it's entirely up to Congress to pass those budgets. And any government, whether it's the city all the way up to the federal, is highly complex and made up of multiple agencies. And when we're voting for our representatives, they've got, you never vote for somebody who agrees with you 100%. We're lucky anymore if we can find somebody who agrees with us 20%. So I just think it's not an issue that people are voting for their specific department. And it's certainly not in my experience that all government employees believe in more government.
Thank you. Thank you. Any additional questions for the speaker? In that case, yes, Leslie Lopato, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, so full disclosure, I am a blue in this red room. Mr. Chair, my question for the speaker is whether they think that the voting process can be a vehicle to engage people more fully in society, and whether excluding people from the voting process may tend to disengage them from society and decrease their sense of responsibility and productivity, or the need to be productive.
I would definitely agree with that. And I believe that there should be no barriers to voting other than being a United States citizen and being 18 years of age. I believe that we all have a responsibility, and that we are electing representatives who are making these decisions on our behalf. This is not a democracy. We don't vote on the budget. We don't vote on the laws and policies. We vote for representatives who we think will support our thoughts. And every group in America is a diverse group. Even amongst all of us Reds, we're a very diverse group, and that's what makes us strong.
Thank you. Thank you. And I see that we have one additional question. Kay Halpern, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker through the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a very quick question. How would the speaker define skin in the game?
Well, yeah, you brought that up, Kay. I wrote your name down even, and you know, there's disagreement amongst the 36 of us here about how we define skin in the game, but I, like you, also feel that it has to do with being affected by what the government does, as well as paying taxes. I think skin in the game is far broader than just paying taxes.
Thank you.
All right, kudos to the speaker and to the questioners. Great speech, great questions. So we now have another speech in the affirmative. Frankie Hires. Frankie, could you please unmute yourself and give your speech of up to 4 minutes?
Sure thing. So obviously, having posed the question that makes it difficult to do this, as a Jeffersonian Republican, I'm having a tough time finding anybody to even have a conversation with me about what I care about, let alone argue with them about it or have somebody agree. Right. So with skin in the game being the topic here, right? I have to go back to where this comes from, right? So why would we ever endeavor to restrict the vote to begin with? Right. And I get into this with those on my left all the time, right? Only white landowning men were allowed to vote. Well, that wasn't true in Vermont. Women had the right to vote. And primarily the reason why this ends up happening, I think, to begin with, is the fear of carpetbagging. You know, in a newly formed nation, and people able to move about as they could, the idea was that if you didn't own land, you were going to be a vagrant. And so we restricted the vote thusly. And it was well reasoned and a good intention. And the Constitution prescribes that the states control this fundamentally, right? The U.S. government can affect this through regulation, but this is something meant to be sovereign to the states. That's why Vermont let women vote, Wyoming let women vote, until suddenly when this pendulum starts swinging and the good intentions will allow for suffrage to be an issue, right? The only reason we have suffrage is because we lack for the power of self-determination. So with regards to restricting the vote, and if we're going to apply it to taxation, I assume that those who are trying to push this in the affirmative, as I would be trying to relate this to income taxation, or perhaps to the direct taxation of property. So if you've got property in the state or you're earning income in a state, then I presume that you would qualify under this kind of restriction. You could find a rationale and a way to do this, but then you'd have to understand what direct taxes were. You'd have to apply the principles of apportionment to it. The 16th Amendment provides for the states not to do this if they are willing to exercise that the superseding power of the federal government, right? They're not obliged to, though. They could apportion their income taxes. They could apportion their property taxes, but they'd have to reach down to the county levels. And I can't find anyone to explain to me what the following phrase means. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution, after we've decided to have a country, empower it to tax us and spend upon us, right? We decided that representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers. Translated that to state level, it would be, and I campaigned against this, nobody can explain how your state government is formed. New Hampshire's looking pretty good with 400 representatives. Trust me, that's about our best example. But I don't know if it's capped. And if you put a cap on a representative body, fundamentally, you violate the principles of apportionment. So when you want to start talking about whether or not taxes are going to be applicable to voting rights, I don't even think anybody knows why you have to vote for so many people. What difference does it make if you have the right to vote if you don't know how the bodies you're voting for are formed? So, yes, we can go ahead and apply this, but then we'd have to determine ourselves to actually have principles that are applicable to these things. So go ahead.
Thanks to the speaker.
Timely enough? I get more time?
You did that pretty well, I would say. I think you hit a pause at a great time. Any questions for the speaker?
It ain't easy, trust me.
They are so blown away, they don't even have any questions. Oh, here we go.
I'm thrilled this guy does.
Derek, Derek, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Derek, you're muted.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So I'm going to ask a point of clarification. So you're in the affirmative that you should have some kind of direct taxation or property taxation stake to be able to vote. That being the case, what would you make of?
What would the speaker make of?
What would the speaker make of 36% of U.S. households being renters? And how would you remedy the obvious political sabotage that a voting barrier campaign at a national level from conservatives would do? And how would you taper the conversation of the narrative so that you have people understand the principles that you're advocating for without it sounding like we're trying to keep people from voting until such time as we deem them having enough of an understanding on how to vote well?
Speaker, do you understand the question?
It's a good one. I'm gonna hope that I do a little bit. So those fundamental principles that we're trying to get across, at least when we started this thing, was about tyranny of a few and confusion of multitudes. And what we're struggling with here is certainly when it comes to the breadth of taxation and the different ways that we do this, employ it. That's where we're sitting in a confusion of multitudes. So your question is tough to kind of like even address, because it speaks to exactly that, right? So how am I going to reconcile some of that and make it so that the voting population that might approve this approach would even know what the hell we're talking about, right? And is that what we're getting at here?
Okay, so question asked and answered. Luke, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker.
Mr. Chair, I'm just wondering which political thinker or which political writer between the 1770s and the 1820s is our Jeffersonian Republican friend's favorite political theorist on this question of representation?
The man himself. So you can find his apportionment letter to George Washington, and absolutely everything that he speaks to applies to every argument we're having now. You can even compare that against the letter of opinion from the Secretary of the Treasury, and the starkness of the comparison. My God, it inspired the musical I wrote about Jefferson. And when Hamilton comes out, he inspires Hamilton shenanigans, which, trust me, y'all gonna hear someday soon. Now, again, Jefferson does it in 18th century English, Victorian English. So trying to get this across to people isn't easy. Wasn't easy for me. I had to learn what direct taxes were, right? I didn't know what they were. I've done my income taxes all my life, but it's not what it is. So if direct taxes are income, basically, if you do it or haven't, we tax it, that's a direct tax. So you got income, you got property, you die, the death tax is a portion. So, but we've exempted the first 10 million. So nobody that's working for a living pays it. So we've completely lost. But that's why every estate is basically set. The rich people all own property in Wyoming, Delaware, in the smallest of states, because they're paying the lowest apportionment rate when it comes to direct taxes that have to be paid. Does that get anywhere through it?
Yep. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you to this speaker and the great questions that were asked. We will now go to a speech in the negative. I don't know who this person is. Does anybody know who Leah Sargent is? Leah, anyway, unmute yourself and ask your question. By the way, I'm kidding, because she's one of the managers of the debate program.
Thank you so much, Paul. I want to start by conceding 3 points to the AF, because they're not at the heart of why I disagree. So I want to grant you all 3 of these points so that I can get to the heart of the disagreement. I will concede that there is some way to track tax status so that I don't care to dispute the practicalities. I want to dispute the values. And I've heard people on the AF say they really do want to get at the question of what it means to be a contributor to the state rather than someone who's primarily taking or living off the state. So I'm going to go ahead and grant that there are a lot of other ways to contribute besides paying taxes. When I'll finally concede that restricting voting to people who are clearly contributing, who are stakeholders in a large restrictive way, is an American idea. It was there at the founding, as earlier speakers have pointed out. So I'll concede all three of those things and still remain in the negative. And here's why. I think this was the mark of being a younger nation, a less mature and a less strong nation than we are now. And it's a mark of strength to have the magnanimity to extend stakeholdership beyond just people who can pay in, but to people who have committed to the creedal nature of American identity, regardless of whether they're able to contribute as much to support it as they want. To be an American means at its core, wanting very strongly to be American because of what America is. I'd really distinguish this from the way that a different empire thought about citizenship. The Romans thought about citizenship as an extremely restrictive category. And then a lot of other people were under the protection of the empire. And that wasn't condescending in an intensely hurtful way. It was that citizenship is a mark above, and that many other people benefit from what the empire does. And there was that clear distinction. I don't think that distinction is appropriate for America, a country of strivers, a country of surprising reversals, a country where we never know which person we welcome is going to be the one we turn out to depend on. So in America, we're looking for people who want to be Americans, whose skin in the game is that they've seen what we are. They know it's what they desire for themselves and their family. And even if they can't give more than they take at the moment, they want to be part of what America is. It's part of what proclaims our strength to the world. I want to close just with one strong thing that happened today, which is that this afternoon, 2 Russian men snuck a boat across the Bering Strait and made landfall on a tiny island that I've never heard of. I think most people on this call have never heard of, but it's an American island. And they came there because they know they don't want to be in Russia anymore. They want to be here. America projects its strength partly because we can afford people who can't contribute yet. We're ready to welcome them as long as they want to be Americans. And I think across the world, the symbol of that strength, of that confidence, of that almost boasting, we can afford to take care of people and make them stakeholders here, even if they can't pay their own way. We're the biggest, best country in the world. There's a reason that those men came here. I yield to questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Rita, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker.
Okay, I've loved all the speeches, but I'm going to tell you mine is a very simplistic question. But, not everybody that comes here has the ideals that Leah is speaking about. And of course, naturally, we know that we don't expect that from every single person, but my sense, and this is just really a comment, I wish that were true, that everyone—
Oh, hey, hang on here, Rita. I mean, you get away with a lot, but you're supposed to be asking a question.
I'm
if
sorry.
you want to make a speech, please, get in line to make a speech.
Okay, sorry, Paul, Mr. Chairman. So my question would be, would the previous speaker please comment on that? Is that better?
Yeah, I think in many ways, our immigration system is like a diversified portfolio. There are people we welcome, confident they have a lot to contribute, people with particular expert visas or special value visas. There are people we accept thinking, yeah, probably, most people coming in on H-1Bs are fine. There are people we accept not because of any expectation we have for them, but because we have a duty to provide shelter. Refugees as a broad class, and Afghan refugees, I would say in particular, we have a unique duty to the people we protected for a time and withdrew our protection from, to give them shelter, regardless of what they can contribute, because we're able to, and because they have put their trust in us. And then, when there are people who we feel more marginal about, I think we come out ahead on net across the portfolio. But I think even, I have what we think of as the lowest tier, where people say economic migrants are the ones we're at least willing to admit. Those are the people who have the most faith that America is the place to support a family. And for the most part are coming for that purpose at a time when across the country, there's less and less faith in the family as an institution. So if you ask me, as someone who's in the red room today, because I'm Catholic, which makes me slightly unwelcome among the blues and slightly unwelcome among the reds, depending on which group I'm speaking to, I have a lot of faith that America is going to be strengthened by people who come here to do their best for their family, and are willing to sneak across a border because their family comes first. But that will be another debate, I'm sure.
Okay. Derek, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker.
Thank you, Chair. Speaker, my question is, if you believe that the intentions of people that come here are not to, prey upon the system and to attempt to assimilate, in issues where that's not the case, what do you think is the best method to go about helping people who have rights, but don't appreciate them, or maybe we feel aren't competent enough civically or educated enough to wield them appropriately being a loaded word. I'm talking about, how do you get them to participate, and what method do you employ to get them to participate? Not to necessarily appreciate the values that the people say in this chat, but to understand the importance of it without using policy.
I think a lot of that work is done person to person, and it's done very well by a lot of faith-based groups that do refugee resettlement or work with immigrants, because often the barriers aren't a matter of willingness, it's a matter of language barriers, culture barriers, lack of connection. And the more that someone, comes to your neighborhood and is met with an introduction of, I'm your neighbor, these are cookies, this is Google Translate if necessary. That's how you make the pitch for America. That's the sense that, your neighbor has a stake, has skin in the game for you, because we're part of a democracy. And even if you don't like your neighbor, you care how they vote. So you might as well make their acquaintance and make your pitch for the values that brought you here in the first place, or in my case, my family.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I'll take, we don't have that many questions, so I think we might very well have time to take all of them. Aaron, please unmute yourself and ask your question of this speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Chair, I'd like to address the speakers or ask the speaker about a much broader subject of past empires that were brought up, and what is preventing, if we allow people with skin in the game, as we've addressed throughout this particular debate, to continue to vote, how we address not allowing our empire, as we are certainly classified at this point, to fail like all others have, under the weight of social programs.
So to be honest, in response to that question, I just don't think it's social programs that are pitching us towards collapse as an empire. I think it's often a lack of faith in values, a lack of faith that there's a truth or a creed at the heart of our country or our empire. And if I'm fighting to figure out where to prop up America in a way that makes it worth propping up, it's much more on questions of institutions like the natural family and on marriage and extended family. Now I go into my hobby horse, zoning reform, so that people can live with their families and really build up roots in their community. And that's where I see us crumbling. It's in our connection to the things that come before the state, before the empire, that they're falling apart, not in the question of exactly how our economic flows are working.
Thank you. Thank you. Frankie Hires, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker.
So first, I want to thank her for seating at least the few points that were seated, and certainly it's well appreciated. I think my question would be basically, I don't know that we've evolved. In other words, I don't see the evolution in the sense that what concerns me is, do you have any concern for why we would have restricted the vote to begin with, and to pivot away from the people and suffrage, right? Why do you think, if you could answer this question, why do you think the people, why do you think the Constitution would restrict the vote to the senators, the U.S. Senate, to the largest body of the state. Why would we not? Why do you think they did that to begin with? And have we benefited from the 17th Amendment then?
Oh boy, yeah, let's get into direct election of senators. Thank you for the question. I really appreciate it because I think the founding fathers were rightly concerned about a certain kind of demagoguery or populism that could sweep away reasoned discourse with enthusiasms. One of the founding fathers, I think it was Livingston, at one point just said, of the people who he was fighting to fill the country for, the lizards are in the streets, right? So our founding fathers took care of the nation, but didn't have respect for every popular fever sweeping the nation. And indirect election of senators meant to be a bulwark against that. If we restored that now, I don't think we'd be any better off. I grew up in New York, which has, one of the most corrupt state legislatures in the country, I would say. There's a museum of corruption in Albany. We've had multiple governors dismissed in office for the numerous crimes they committed. So, indirect election of senators is not going to get us back where we were. I think the concern was merited. And now my concern is more with mass media and kind of the algorithm-driven big tech culture that sweeps people into enthusiasms than it is with the popular method of voting.
Okay, so I, as the chair, I'm going to indulge myself a little bit here. I see two more questions, and I think we might be able to get them both in. Henry McHenry, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker.
I wonder if sorry, I'm sorry I don't have any video, but I'm low on bandwidth here. But I wonder if the speaker has any dissertation about what was meant by the three words, "we the people."
I'd love a clarification if possible, Mr. Chair, just because I could do a dissertation, but I don't know if it would be responsive to what Mr. McHenry is seeking from the question.
I would say just, try to give a brief, succinct answer.
All right.
And a historically informed answer, please.
Then I'll say at the most basic level that the founding fathers were aware there was a form of equality that everyone in America participated in that united them more than questions of citizenship or voting access, and is that they were all creations of God, equal in dignity by being sons and daughters adopted through Christ. Most of the founding fathers, some of them were deists, and Thomas Jefferson was a heretic. But we, the people, start from that base level of equality. It's true. I see some reactions, but it's definitely true. When you cut up the Bible and make your own version, that's what you are. But the majority of them thought of we, the people, as starting from that basic dignity rooted in who we are, not what we had accomplished.
So thank you. And by the way, I would try to remind people that we kind of, gestures are, like jazz hands, but other forms of physical gestures we tend to like to discourage in our debates. Barbie Klein, please unmute yourself and ask your question of the speaker.
Well, I have a question. I'm late to this party. I was stuck in the blue debate for, I don't know how, until after well after 6 o'clock anyway. And I finally found, because I was in my emails, I was looking and I had all these links, go to the debate, and I would click on the red one and I would go right back to the blue. Then I finally found from the chairperson there a direct link to this. And so I've been late to the party, and I would like someone to tell me what the question is, because I don't remember what it is that we're debating, and I can't make sense out of what people are saying.
I'm happy to clarify as an answer, especially since I may have contributed to your confusion with my digression on Thomas Jefferson. We are debating resolved only taxpayers should vote. And I think our main differences of opinion have cycled around who is a stakeholder in America and who can be trusted to have her best interests at heart.
Okay,
And
thank
with
you.
that,
Yes, I would like to.
I'm sorry, we need to move on. I'm sorry, we do.
Oh,
need
I
to
didn't
move on.
get
Thank you.
to ask a question of, I asked a question of you, Mr. Chair, and I didn't ask a question
Okay,
of the
what's your
speaker.
question for the speaker? I'm sorry.
What is the well, or it could be to you too. What is the definition of taxpayer here? That's what I couldn't understand from what I had heard. What is the definition of taxpayer?
So actually, I, as chair, will address that.
Thank you.
We specifically did not define exactly what a taxpayer was, with the intent that that would actually become a substantial part of the debate.
I see.
So I think we're getting close to the end. I want to take a little risk here. This may end up being the last time I chair because I'm taking a risk. But I think we're going to do some eccentric speeches, very short eccentric speeches. And Luke has offered to do an eccentric speech in the affirmative, but Luke, you only got 1 minute or less.
Mr. Chair, may I defer my time to you?
No, because I'm in the negative.
Okay, well, so I am affirmative on this resolution very regretfully, actually, not out of any particular belief in the virtue of people who work for themselves or anything like that. I'm in the affirmative on this resolution regretfully, because I think if you go under the assumption that is very common in much of American political discourse, that the act of voting and also the act of political representation requires you to not only be of the political community, but also to be excellent and demonstrate some sorts of virtues of some sort or another, be that measuredness or intelligence or public spiritedness or whatever. Any line of logic that says we have to be, a government can only rely on its citizenry, and those citizens must be virtuous, necessarily winds up saying, well, you have to have some kind of qualifications to vote, be that paying taxes, or be that being educated at a certain level or whatever. And so
Luke, you're over your minute. You're over your minute, Luke.
I apologize, Mr. Chair. I don't think I can give the full punch of my speech in under a minute.
Okay.
I defer my time to you.
So I'm going to do something that is legal but very rarely done, which is a chair speech. So I am going to hand the gavel to Luke for less than a minute while I give my chair speech. Okay, so I am going to speak in the negative for a very, very simple reason. When this was first proposed, I thought it was obviously a great idea. And then as I thought about it more and more, I began to realize that I am drawing Social Security and a government pension. So even though I pay a significant amount of money in taxes, I am not a net positive taxpayer. So therefore, from the point of pure selfishness, self-interest, and egotism, I have to oppose this particular proposition. So with that, Luke, I would like the gavel back, please, so that I can resume my role as chair. Okay, thank you. I have the gavel back. So now we have this period where we get to share what did you learn? Oh, by the way, we aren't taking any questions on either of those speeches, for God's sake, no. So at this point, we go into the section where what did you learn and what did you appreciate? What did you learn or what did you appreciate from this? Very briefly, it's not a chance to give another speech. And the chat will be open now so that you can, if you don't get a chance to say it out loud, you can say it in chat. Frankie Hires, what did you learn or what did you appreciate from this debate?
Mostly make sure to like jot down my points, because certainly that last one I missed. I think a lot of the principles get turned on their head. So, figuring out how to plot out and hit the points that you need to make when you're going to engage these is important. Don't leave no meat on the table kind of thing. I could explain that I think, 17th Amendment was there so that you weren't overwhelmed as a voter, and so we pay attention.
Okay.
to form.
Not a chance to
Matter.
give it the speech. Thank you. Kathy, what did you learn or what did you appreciate?
I changed my views a little bit, but I came away with this question: who are we to judge?
Thank you. Ann Russell, what did you learn or appreciate?
I learned that this is a tremendously complicated question, that it is not something that can be answered quickly, and having given some thought to it, it definitely is not, I'm not sure that, I was affirmative when we started. I'm not sure any longer that on its face, it's a good sentence, it's a good decision. There's so many things that everybody brought up, the barriers, the people that are hurt, the people that are left out. So I just learned it's a much bigger question than it looked like initially.
Thank you. Derek Hughes, what did you learn or what did you appreciate?
Well, I'd like to say that I appreciate that the stronger narrative based on what people were saying probably is to tell people how to exercise their ability to vote instead of when they can do it.
Okay, thank you. So now I would like to ask for a motion to adjourn the debate. I actually should have done that earlier, but I could do it now. Motion to adjourn? Okay, seconded? Adjourned. So Luke, do you have any information to share with us about Braver Angels and why people might want to join it or even send money, for gosh sakes?
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for chairing a great debate, and thank you for doing all this. And I'd like to apologize to all of you for giving the worst speech of this debate very briefly at the last second there. Come to a couple more of those, and you might see me very slightly, very partially redeem myself in some aspect. But more importantly, you can give great speeches, and your friends can give great speeches, and people you know who you barely know but you know are interesting people to talk about politically can give great speeches and all that. I mean, what were we talking about here at the fundamental level of this debate? We were fundamentally talking about what is the prerequisite for political participation, right? And I think at some level, part of the best of both sides of that is, on the one hand, we need to strive to be excellent. And on the other hand, everybody can strive to be excellent. And here at Braver Angels, here in everything we do, in the debates, in the workshops, in all of our programming and media, in all of our work with alliances, the only requirement for you to get involved and to do work with us to not only represent what you believe and bring that to your fellow Americans in ways that can that they can see and can help us to get through the storms of our times in our public life nowadays. The only thing you need to do to be able to shine well like that is to hold yourself to the standards of being excellent in the public square and in the public space and in your discourse with your fellow Americans. And that's what we did here tonight in this Braver Angels debate. That's what our blue brothers and sisters and cousins did in their Braver Angels debate tonight. That's what we do on every Braver Angels debate. That's what we do in all of our programming, in our workshops and everything else. And that is, at the end of the day, will it change politics? Will it change who gets elected president of the United States? Will it bring about a revolution in consciousness that will bring forth the millennium and solve the American experiment? I don't know. I doubt it. And I think that that's not really the issue. The issue is that it helps us be the best versions of ourselves in this American tradition of government. And at some level, that's, I think, the great promise Braver Angels has, that we conservatives have a special duty to show to our fellow conservatives and our fellow Americans as an avenue of patriotism. So, Paul, sorry to be kind of weird about that, but everybody here, if you're interested in getting involved, please keep coming to the debates. Please keep coming to to our events. Please find ways to get involved. There's always stuff to do. We couldn't do this without volunteers and without people who are interested in doing this kind of work. I think it's probably in order that eventually we do an eccentric debate on the nature of the American founding. Mr. Hires, I confess to you that I myself am an unreconstructed Hamiltonian Federalist, and I will look forward to a fascinating discussion and debate with you on whatever that future debate we wind up doing is. So, but with that, thank you everybody who was here tonight, and Paul, thank you for doing an excellent job chairing here.